I've noticed that there's certain problems that people who are building an egg chair or a womb chair run into, and that's because there's some similarities in the way those two chairs are constructed. Both chairs involve making some sort of a primary surface. In this case, I'm using the egg chair as an example, and we have an outer shell surface and an inner seating surface. And the idea is to offset the seating surface and later on build a transitional surface back to this edge to give the impression of a seating surface that has some cushioning in it. And the same is done with the back shell as well. And a similar technique is used for the womb chair. One of the problems that can arise is when you offset some of these complicated curvy surfaces. And I'll show you what can happen when you do that and what you can do about it. Both of these surfaces were created so that these edges here are lying on the right-hand plane, and the right-hand plane is later used as a mirror plane in order to get the other half of the seat. If I take a measurement from the right-hand plane to one of these edges, I see that it says that the selected items intersect. That means that this edge is actually on the right plane. If I do the same with the other edge, selecting the right plane and this edge now, and take a measurement, again it says the selected items intersect. So that's a good thing. And these surfaces should have been built so that they go normal to the right plane so that they seamlessly blend when mirrored. I'm going to offset this surface, and that's going to be used for creating a cushiony surface. There's my offset surface, and because this surface is normal to the mirror plane and this edge is on the mirror plane, what theoretically should happen is that the new edge of the offset surface should also be normal to the mirror plane and also be on the mirror plane. So if I once again take a measurement from the right plane to this edge, it says the distance is 0.000 inches, which implies that this edge is right on the mirror plane. But it doesn't say that the surfaces intersect, and this is a very important distinction. So if I go up into my units precision and crank up the number of decimal places, let's say to 6, we suddenly see that way out in the 5th and 6th decimal places that it says that there is a distance of 0.00046 millimeters between the edge of the surface and the right plane, meaning that they don't really truly intersect. That's such a tiny amount of room or distance that it hardly seems like that should matter, but it can cause some problems later on down the road. For example, when building the egg chair or the womb chair, this offset surface needs to be trimmed back a certain distance and a new transitional surface built that will go from the trimmed back surface back to the seam edge to give the impression of a puffy, stuffed, cushiony chair. I'm going to trim this back by sweeping a circular cross section along this edge and then use that circular cross section to trim away this excess material. So there's my trim back, and I'll just hide this pipe-shaped sweep. And what I want to do is build a boundary surface between the two. Now if I want to control the boundary surface with, say, a cross-sectional sketch here that will give me some control over the shape, and I'm going to put that on the right plane, I'm just going to make a spline here. Theoretically, I should be able to make a pierce relation between this edge and this point, which it lets me do because I know that this edge meets my right plane where the sketch is located. And I should be able to make a pierce relation between this edge and this point. It says no intersection found for the pierce point. Well, why is that happening? The reason it's happening is that this edge is not quite making it all the way to my sketch plane. The distance, as we noted before, is like millionth of a millimeter, but that's enough to prevent me from having my Pierce relation. I could make a coincident relation, but later on when I go to make a boundary using these two edges in direction 1 and the sketch that I'm attempting to make here in direction 2, I can get some weird effects going on the boundary surface, or it may refuse to make the boundary surface altogether. So how can I fix this situation? One trick I like to use, I'll get out of this sketch, is to purposely extend this edge a little bit. So I'll go into Surfaces and Extend Surface. So just click on this edge that is not quite making it all the way to the right-hand plane. And I don't really need to extend it all that much. If you're having trouble extending it, you could probably extend it as little as 0.01 inches, and that will be enough. But I'll make it a full inch so you can see what's going to happen. So if we look at this from the top view, we can see that this is extending well beyond the right-hand plane, which I'm highlighting now. Now what I'm going to do is go into the Trim Surface command. I'm going to use the standard trim, and my trim tool will be the right-hand plane. And I'm going to keep this portion here. Now we're going to go ahead and remeasure the distance between the right plane and that edge. So selecting the right plane and this edge here and taking the measurement, and now it says the selected items intersect. So now if I go to make that sketch between this edge and this edge, I should be able to pierce that spline to this edge. So moving on, I'm going to go ahead and roll my model forward a little bit, and I'm going to make that boundary surface between these two edges. I'm going to hide this edge here. And I made the boundary surface without bothering to put any sketches on the mirror plane or in any intermediate areas, just for the sake of expediency. So there's my surface, and you can see this gives the impression of kind of a stuffed, cushiony surface. Eventually what I want to do is have a new surface capping this open area and then knit them all together and finally turn them into a solid body. So first I'm just going to knit this surface to this boundary that was added, and because I have tangent edges made non-visible, you see that that edge has disappeared and these two surfaces are blending together. If I really want this surface to look really good, I would probably make a cross-sectional sketch here, here, and maybe here. Now, one way to add this third surface and then trim everything together is to make a planar surface between all these edges and then knit everything together. The only trouble with that is sometimes you have a lot of little edges you have to select to make the planar surface, or you might still have that issue where one of these edges is not quite making it all the way to the plane. So another method I can use is to first just extrude a surface that's coincident with the right-hand plane. I'm going to make that 0. So the distance between that line and the right-hand plane are 0. So this is on the right-hand plane. These edges touch the right-hand plane. And I should be able to do a mutual trim where I select all three surfaces, get rid of the pieces that I don't want, and turn it into a solid. So I'm going to try that out. So trim surface, mutual. I've got 1, 2, 3 surfaces to select. And I want to get rid of this piece here. So I'll say remove. And get rid of that. And it looks like it's going to be successful because it's hiding the surface that I selected. And I click on that. And you see that this hasn't quite worked out. It didn't grab this part, probably because this boundary ended up not going quite all the way to the mirror plane. Maybe if I had had a sketch on the mirror plane for this boundary, that would have guaranteed that this boundary got pulled up to the sketch plane. But let's say I didn't want to have a sketch there or go through all that trouble, but I know I can't knit these together and make this a solid. And you'll see that normally with a mutual trim, the trimmed surfaces should be knitted along the edges. So even though this got trimmed along this edge, you notice that the edge is still blue instead of black, meaning no knitting was occurring here. So I'm going to roll or re-edit that sketch for the extruded surface on the right plane. You notice that I'd had a dimension there. I'm going to purposely, if I can ever edit this dimension, I'm going to move that line over a little bit so it's to the right of the mirror plane. It doesn't have to be very much. I'll make it about 0.02 inches. And so you can see that the other seat surfaces are going to pass through this and end up going all the way through to the other side. So getting out of the sketch, and rolling back, I want to just show you what this looks like before trimming. And we can see that the seat surfaces are just barely passing through my extruded surface. When you're doing a mutual trim, this is usually the desired situation, is that you don't want surfaces just to stop on other surfaces. You want them to actually pass through each other so that when you do a trim, you get a very good, clean trimming result. So as long as one surface goes a little bit through the other one, you're going to get a more reliable situation. So now if I'm going to trim these again as a mutual trim, we have mutual selected. I'm going to reselect these three surfaces, and now I'm going to indicate what I want to keep instead of what I want to remove. Otherwise I have to tell it to remove these thin little areas left over on the left side of the right plane, and that's just very hard to select those. So I'm going to go to Keep. So now selecting the surfaces that I want to keep, I'll grab this L-shaped portion on this surface here, which is not quite on the right plane, this upper surface, this lower surface, and you notice they all disappear because I have this option selected where the surfaces I selected are hidden. So I finish this. Oh wait, before I do that, I want to go down, and we notice that Create Solid is an available option now. If this was not a good mutual trim, this would probably be grayed out. So I'm going to check that, select the green check mark, and we see that all of these edges now are black, meaning that they have been trimmed and they are knit together. But we have one little problem where I purposely made this surface 0.02 inches to the right of the mirror plane being the right plane. So I need to move this back to where it belongs, otherwise it won't be able to mirror this properly. That's where I use the move face command. If you can't find it, go ahead and search for it up here using the search commands option. So I choose move face. I'll use the offset option. I'll just click on this face and move that back over by 0.02 inches, which apparently I'd set earlier when I was experimenting with this. You can see the highlight where it's moved over a little bit. So you saw that shift over, and to confirm that this works well, I'm going to do a mirror. In the mirror plane, I'm going to use the right-hand plane, this body, and merge solids. And we see that this is mirrored seamlessly, and because I have tangent edges hidden, we don't see any edge along here, meaning that that has successfully blended together the original surface and the mirrored surface. Those are tangent. Okay, there's one other issue that I want to talk about, Again, this is on both the womb and the egg chair. And that's when you're adding this transitional surface to give the puffy cushion look. You probably want to have some intermediate cross-sectional sketches like here, here, and here. And you have to be careful how you draw those. So I'm going to roll back a little bit, and let's just say that I want to have a sketch right about in this area. I'm going to trim this back a little farther than I did before. So I'm going to change the diameter of this swept pipe to 3 inches, which means that the edge will end up being trimmed back by the radius of the pipe, which is 1.5 inches. Okay, now it just so turns out that I have a plane right in that location already, so I'm going to sketch on that plane, and I'm going to draw a spline from this line to this outer edge. So just drag this out here, a 2-point spline, and I'll pierce to either edge here, or both edges. Pierce to the outer, pierce to the inner edge, and then I want to give this some shaping here. So I'm going to grab my spline handles and sort of shape this. That looks like that's going to be kind of a nice looking shape to give the impression of this cushion. But here's the problem that people run into. The question is, how do you know what direction to make the spline where it attaches to this inner surface? We want this spline to blend smoothly with the inner surface. So in order to do that, we need to know what the shape of the inner surface is at our sketch plane. And right now I have no idea whether this should go a little more like this or a little more like that. So how do I find that out? What I want to do is use the intersection curve option in sketches. And when I do that, I can click on this surface, and when I'm in a sketch, what it will do is give me the shape of this curve, or the shape of this surface, where it passes through the sketch plane that we are working on. It's the same as taking the sketch plane and slicing right through the surface and seeing where that line is. So if I click on the check mark, I see that the shape of the surface, the contour of the surface, right where I'm drawing my sketch, is this black line right here. So if that's the shape of the surface right at the sketch plane, it means that this spline and this line have to be tangent and possibly equal curvature to each other. So I have to grab this spline now and this intersection curve and at least make them tangent and ideally make them equal curvature. That will guarantee when I make my boundary using this spline in direction 2 that the shape of the boundary right at this particular cross-section will conform to the shape of this surface that I'm mousing over. The next thing I want to do is turn this spline, which represents the shape of that surface, to a construction line, because I don't want this line to be part of my boundary surface. So if you find that when you make your boundary and you have a bunch of intermediate sketches and it looks like that boundary surface is not blending well to this surface, it's probably because you haven't made an intersection curve and made a tangent or equal curvature to it. So go back and check all of those cross sections if you're seeing an issue before moving on. That's it. I hope this helps.